seen some of this before. All Americans should be looking at this, or should have looked at this in terms of explosive, is the behavior, both the autopsy of the president and the behavior of the Secret Service. I think there's two fundamental things that just simply can't be ignored. And it's a complicated story, especially when we look at this medical evidence. It's like bizarre, okay? Some of you have seen it before, but let's get into it, okay? What you see in front of you is, of course, well, let's go through the things. All right, so the president's taken to Parkland Hospital immediately after the assassination, the emergency room. They try to revive him for a few minutes, for 20, 30 minutes. They failed. But there were 28 nurses and doctors that all saw his wounds very clearly, and that's an important point to know. Then, of course, he's going to be taken back across the country, which probably wasn't in itself illegal. The autopsy by state law should have been done in Texas. It was almost the Secret Service had to strong arm the casket out of the hands of the hospital officials who wanted to do the autopsy right there. If it had been done right there, maybe we'd have a whole different picture of this history. Okay? Because all these things start to emerge that are discrepancies that scream at you. Okay? That are hard to ignore. Okay? And now, hang on. Here we go. I'm lost without it. Okay. What you have in front of you is two pictures. The picture on the left is what most of the people in Parkland Hospital and even some of the people at Bethesda Naval Hospital, where the autopsy occurred at, saw at the back of Kennedy's head being blown out with a fist-sized hole, consistent with shots from the front, from the grassy knoll area. And you know that would be what a lot of physicians, people that their first glance, that's what they thought they saw. What you have on the right, though, comes to be an official autopsy photograph where the president's head is intact. The ruler points at a small bullet hole in the back of his head, which would be something akin with a shot in the rear, like Oswald did. This picture has been repudiated by virtually everybody that ever saw it later on. You know, FBI guys that were there on the scene said this has been doctored. Over and over, doctors, everybody. This photo has been doctored. This photo has been tampered with. Well, you know what? This is the official autopsy photograph, which means somebody did something. They committed treason, doctoring photographs, but I guess they felt like they could get away with it. That's exactly what's going on here. Okay? 28 doctors and nurses and other people. You see that consistently there. Everybody's doing the same thing. They're putting it like this. I mean, independently. Okay, House Select Assassinations in the 1970s, the Congress went back and looked at it a second time and said, well, all these people must be wrong. You know, like all 50 people on the Truman Plaza must have been wrong. Okay. All right, now this guy has come to our campus named Dennis David and has an incredible story.
Dennis David didn't find it peculiar, but he saw the Navy ambulance arrive after a shipping casket was brought to the morgue.
Things get weird.
If he's right, then the body was at Bethesda before Jacqueline Kennedy. He's supported by Gerald Custer, the X-ray technician, now an X-ray technician in Pittsburgh. Custer says he was carrying autopsy X-rays to be developed when he saw Mrs. Kennedy arrive.
Is this why
when you encountered Jacqueline Kennedy, when you saw her in the lobby, had you already taken any X-rays?
Well, we had an armful at the time, and my apron or gown that I had on was bloody.
I want you to know, I would like to ask you how you react to the fact that if you had already had the X-rays in your hand, the body was already in the morgue when she walked in the door, and yet she just got out of the ambulance containing the casket.
And these guys
How
already
firm are you in your recollection
JFK.
that you saw Jackie when you already had taken X-rays? Is that without question, or would you say that you might waver on that?
No, because I'm almost assured I had X-rays in my arm at the time when I saw her. We had just finished taking some X-rays.
That would mean that the casket in the ambulance parked right outside is empty.
That would have to be it, because we had just left the morgue, and I'm sure that we took X-rays. I know we did, because we had a security man with us at the time.
Dennis, is it possible you're wrong about the sequence? That in order to... The sequence is crucial. If the body was in the morgue before Jacqueline and the Gray Navy ambulance arrived, then Jacqueline Kennedy was with an empty casket. But you're wrong about the sequence. What really happened is first you saw Jackie come in the front, And then you went around back and saw a black vehicle arrive at the loading dock.
No way. I remember that vividly. The ambulance, and we offloaded a casket at the back of the hospital a good 15 or 20 minutes before Jackie Kennedy came in.
Dennis David and Gerald Custer both indicate that the body was already in the Bethesda morgue when Jacqueline Kennedy arrived. I've also spoken to others in Bethesda that night. They didn't know about the sequence, but they did talk of 2 ambulances. The explanation was always the same: security. Some called it the decoy ambulance. One said it was Navy strategy. But a key authority denies that these security measures were taken. In July 1980, I had a 2.5-hour tape-recorded interview with General Chester Clifton, which I report at length in Best Evidence. General Clifton was a senior military aide to President Kennedy. He was aboard Air Force One and made arrangements by radio for the autopsy. Clifton insisted there was no decoy ambulance, that no special security arrangements were made. The FBI didn't know about any.
So, liar, okay. I don't know where that came on at the end, why. I don't think Dennis David is a liar. Dennis David and several others, medical personnel that were at Bethesda Hospital, all basically said, you know what, we had an arrival of an ambulance in the back, it came in a common gray casket, in a body bag, the president's body. Well, the whole world saw a big bronze casket loaded onto the Air Force One. And now this guy's saying, well, we had autopsy photographs. David said the same thing. You know, I was standing up on the balcony when Jackie arrived and we've already received. Well, what was going on? This is crazy stuff. You know, and you got different wounds. You saw a picture of the different wounds. I don't know if there's a photo being doctored there or actual wounds being doctored. I mean, Kennedy's throat wound goes from a small one in Parkland to a much wider exit hole. The fist-sized back and hole in terms of a massive head wound with this entire brain gone. Different caskets, body bag, no body bag. This is crazy stuff. But, you know, all I can say is I've looked as hard as I can for 20 plus years, and I've never found anything that can repudiate this. These are honest people making these assertions. In my mind. Then Doug Horn, who was a United States government investigator, worked for the government. He came on my campus here and spoke and studied this stuff in detail. Basically, he said he interviewed the autopsy doctors, who, by the way, none of them were qualified practicing pathologists. They were brought in the last minute by the military. But he said, ultimately came to the conclusion, based upon his interviews for the United States government, there were 2 brain exams and 2 different brains. I don't know what's going on there. And then we still don't know where the brain tissues of JFK are even at till today. Maybe the Kennedy family has them. It's a mystery. So all this stuff going on, you know, again, was there some sort of shenanigans, some sort of shell game going on with the president's body, the best evidence? These things are serious stuff and almost too incredible to believe, I know. But you have to start to ask the question, you know, who some of these things went on. I mean, did the people involved with this think they had to make some last-minute decisions to make some changes here, to make this consistent with what the cover story was? Maybe so. Well, it wasn't just photographs. It was X-rays. Experts that looked at X-rays say the X-rays in the archives are not consistent. They look like they've been altered. Photographs. People who took the original photographs say the photographs in the autopsy are not the ones they've taken. It's not the same film. On and on and on. It's just like everything in terms of evidence in this case seems to be tampered with over and over again. You keep running into that. You can't escape it. Okay? All right, now,
that would have revealed that the motorcade in Dallas.
Let's go to that. I mean, medical evidence, I think, is important to look at, and then you got to look at what happened with the Secret Service. And I'm going to give you a little short film for you here, and here we go.
That would have revealed that the motorcade in Dallas was a travesty, a violation of at least 15 different Secret Service policies for presidential protection. This behavior on their part raises the most serious and disturbing questions about their complicity in the entire affair.
From the moment he arrived in Dallas, the president's protection was suspect, according to Vince Palomara, a Secret Service expert.
There was last-minute changes invoked by the Secret Service involving President Kennedy's security. Specifically, agents were told not to ride on or near the rear of the limousine.
Okay.
Now, these orders were funneled from the Assistant Special Agent in charge of the White House detail, who was the planner of the Texas trip, Floyd Boring, to one of his assistants, a shift leader by the name of Henry Roberts, who was in charge of the follow-up car. You can see an agent, Henry Ripka, doing his normal duty, jogging besides the limousine, when in the follow-up car, you can see Henry Roberts stand up and wave him back, and you can see a very perplexed Agent Ripka waving his arms in the air several times and seeming disgust.
What's going on? Why am I not
There was
in the
another
car?
last-minute change made at Love Field, invoked
I mean, this is getting along here, but there are other
by the Secret Service. The Dallas Police Department motorcycle outriders were told
that's not going to work for me, but there were multiple things there that went on with the Secret
not
Service.
to be.
Okay, well, let's go back to this thing about, well, there's a motorcade in 1961 in Berlin. You see the president's cars bracketed with police motorcycles and Secret Service agents riding on the rails. I mean, if even one agent had been there, Kennedy, which may have been hit once, but would have survived. They weren't there. Why? It was typical for them to be there. Why? Okay, and there are other things here too. I don't know if I've got this all summarized. There's multiple things involved in the Secret Service. Number one, Dallas was a known dangerous city. Yet they send the JV team to Dallas, basically, the third stringer, Roy Kellerman. The other two guys stay behind. Floyd Boring's important as he was the agent really overseeing the mission. Floyd Boring's the guy who circulated the story that the president didn't want those agents on the car. He wanted the folks to see him in the crowd. And if that's true, then it answers that question. But when Palomara interviewed these guys individually in the 1990s, these surviving agents, they all said an opposite thing. They said, no, the president never ordered us off the car. He never told us what to do. And then when Palomara confronted Boring, Boring backed off and said, well, I was just telling a little story, an anecdote, a funny story about the president. Well, yeah, that got in William Manchester's book, Death of the President. And now the average American on the street believes that Kennedy told him to get off the car when he did not. That's important. The press car, usually right up front, well, that was moved to the 11th car. You got to ask the question, who did those manipulations? Secret Service people, Johnson people. Emory Roberts was the guy who stood up in the car and told the agent not to get on the car. Other agents said when shots were fired, the same agent in charge, Emory Roberts, told him not to move. Now, do you not find that suspicious? Now, you've seen some other agents come forward and they're out there telling a different story, writing books and trying to massage things over. But then Palomara interviewed these guys in the 90s individually, separately, and got their stories. There's even one Secret Service guy is even out there saying, well, how come that agent got ordered off the car? Well, it was time for lunch. Like, really? It was time to go to lunch. So that's why the guy had to get off the car. So you got to ask the question, who had the power to manipulate the autopsy in the Secret Service? And you start to get into who killed the president thing here. So you have to understand this. If you get to the point where you see these things happening and you believe they happen, then you have to talk about a high level of power. I mean, we're going to talk about some of the potentials here, but we'll save that question. Who had the power to manipulate the autopsy? Who had the power to eliminate the Secret Service? It has to be an inside job. It can't be the mob or a few Cuban exiles or the KGB. Okay, so the ultimate question I'm asked all the time. So who killed Kennedy? Well, we are left to speculate, right? And people have their different theories. And we can go through that stuff, and you can judge for yourself. And I'll try to balance these things out. I mean, the mob, the CIA, LBJ, his Texas friends, someone else. There's no question that Kennedy made a whole lot of enemies, to say the least. He alienated some of the most powerful people in the country. By the way, I want to tell my story. I maybe told this before too. Let's go back a minute to the autopsy thing. Maybe about 10 years ago, you might have been here when I did this. I had a chemistry teacher stand up and say, after we did that autopsy stuff, who was actually worked, she's not here now, but she worked for the Illinois State Police in forensics. So she's an expert, and she got up and looked, wait a minute, what's going on? We need to do something about this now. Where's the FBI? And I go, you know what, this is not like anything else. This is not a normal thing. I can't tell you why. You know, no, the FBI isn't going to come and solve this tomorrow like they should. It's just the way things are. I mean, you didn't have an answer for it probably as good as you wanted. Okay. All right, so let's talk about it. Let's talk, you know, the CIA is always the favorite target to suggest maybe it was involved in assassination. People want to look at documents associated with the CIA. And you have to look at, you know, what the motive would be. Again, to give you a quick history lesson, of course, you had Castro down in Cuba who had taken over as a communist. Castro was a favorite target of the CIA, who was basically running their own foreign policy and conducting coups d'etats and assassination attempts against various foreign leaders, and had been successful. And on their own, without the knowledge of the American people. And the target became Castro. The Mafia, which also worked hand in glove with the CIA, incredibly, but true, to try to get rid of Castro. And Cuban exiles who had been ran out of the country by Castro. You had a whole bunch of people here in America in that category who wanted to get rid of Castro. We had the Bay of Pigs invasion, of course you know, 1961. CIA operation to try to start some sort of invasion and groundswell of support to get rid of Castro. It ended up in disaster. Kennedy approved it, but felt deceived by it because he told the CIA, we're not going to send in American ground troops. You can train these exiles to do this job, but we're not going to send the Air Force and the Navy in on this deal. We're not going to invade another country. Well, the whole thing was a disaster on the beach. I think the CIA probably, you know, they didn't even send their best people on this operation. I think this was almost, Allen Dulles, who was the head of the CIA, wasn't even in the building himself. He was hanging out doing it. I think this whole thing was almost made to fail to force Kennedy to send in the troops, send in the Navy, send in the Air Force. He said, I'm not going to do it. We'll take the fall. And after that, there was an enormous amount of hatred between both Kennedy, who said, you know, at some point the CIA is not going to do this stuff any longer. I will scatter the CIA into 1,000 pieces. You've heard that probably before. And among the Cuban exiles, among CIA operatives that we're about to talk about, there was a tremendous contempt for Kennedy and hatred. There's no doubt about it. Okay? And at some point, you know, is it going to be considered soft on communism? Yeah. I mean, because that's the thing that drove the CIA in the 1960s. So let's look at some of these people. Again, this is the speed version here, and my details. Okay? We've already mentioned E. Howard Hunt's confession. David Adley Phillips, a master propagandist who was the Mexico City chief, who was spreading stuff around about Oswald's connections to the Russians and the Cubans right after the assassination. A guy who lied before Congress and said the tapes of Oswald didn't exist anymore in the 1970s when they really did. A guy who, Antonio Viciana, a Cuban exile, said he saw him with Lee Oswald a month before the assassination. Wouldn't you like to know about David Adley Phillips a little more? Well, you got a chance to look at his file that was released with the redactions. And there are other people here today. Again, Morales was a known hitman in the CIA. Harvey was the James Bond of the CIA who hated Kennedy. These guys were all fingered by Hunt, if you want to believe his confession. All hated Kennedy, all had the rationale. And then there's Allen Dulles, who's in the CIA, who becomes in the Warren Commission to make sure everything's cool afterwards, right? He was kind of out in the weeds, so to speak, by 1963. Because of the Bay of Pigs, Allen Dulles was fired. He was fired by Kennedy, yet he's asked to investigate his death. So these are some of the people that are suspects. All right, well, let's look at some of these new documents and stuff I went over here, okay? I mean, I'll just tell you, I mean, I looked at the Phillips file that came out of David Atlee Phillips, and there were like 20 blank pages, okay? I think what was on those 20 blank pages that were probably redacted last minute are probably more important than what I'm going to tell you, I'm sorry to say. But here's some things I know. Usually, what was redacted in the files were places and names. But I think they missed this one. I found a fitness report from Phillips in his file, kind of committing for his efforts in the overthrow of Allende and government in Chile. Of course, we know there was an orchestrated plot, people didn't know at the time, but a massive CIA plot to get rid of the Marxist-elected president of Chile, Salvador Allende. It's interesting that the CIA, another thing I found was that, like, okay, they over and over, I saw this, they regarded foreign leaders they didn't like as simply targets. That reference to not a person, but a target. Okay? And so I think, we can safely say that virtually every coup d'etat assassination, the CIA, removal of foreign leaders, David Atlee Phillips, the master propagandist, was probably involved in or part of it. Okay, I think we can make that summation. And I've just told you about the things in terms of his association with Dallas. What have I got here? That's a blank page. Why am I bringing that up? Because, okay, let's make sure, I'm going to tell you why I'm putting a blank page up here. Make sure I got it right here. Yeah, okay. Okay, so what about E. Howard Hunt's file? I looked at that. There's another more interesting stuff there. 11 blank pages like the one you see right here. In fact, probably the most significant one was Hunt's file was in chronological order as I went through his personnel evaluation. We get up to September 1962, and there's one blank page, and then it goes to July 64. Okay. I'd like to see that one page. Maybe we will. Hunt, it's interesting that he put on his career profile that he was a regional troubleshooter. I love the verbiage of the CIA. All the stuff that Hunt was involved with, right up through Watergate, and interesting was he did a lot of troubleshooting. Okay? All right. Well, what about the mob? Again, I'm trying to move fast here. Obviously, the guy that shot JFK, shot Lee Harvey Oswald, walked into the Dallas jail was Jack Ruby. Ruby had all sorts of connections to the Chicago mob, which the Warren Commission completely ignored and said he had no mob connections. Really. Well, there's a whole list of phone calls that on his phone list leading up to the assassination with mob figures. And a lot of things. I mean, I could tell you so many things about Ruby, and I don't have time. Okay? Carlos Marcello, who was dumped by RFK, the Attorney General, who went after the mob as aggressively as he did, who was dumped in the jungle by RFK as deporting an illegal immigrant. And Marcello had to barely survive and make his way back in the jungles. The New Orleans mobster, he had something to, and Marcello had a lot of connections with other powerful people around the country. He certainly is suspicious. Santos Traficante had all the casinos in Cuba that he lost. That was their deal with the mob. They wanted Havana was like Vegas. They wanted it back. They worked with the CIA in that respect. Johnny Roselli was kind of a movie star mobster who was a liaison between the CIA, because they worked together with the mob, yeah. And some strange things with Roselli. I've heard stories both ways on him. His file, strangely, the FBI was monitoring him, wiretapping him, but it goes blank 2 weeks before and after the assassination. There are those. I've talked to a guy named Tosh Plumley, who was a fascinating character I talked about before. Plumley's got an amazing story about a CIA mercenary pilot, probably working for military intelligence. He still flies today. He's still alive. He said that Roselli was actually a man trying to stop the assassination, part of an abort team that was landed as they got wind of what was going on, potentially in Dallas. So here's where you get all the things where, like, man, my head's spinning here. I mean, you know, who was Roselli? That's just one more question. Who was he? What was he? Which side was he on? Sam Giancana was a Chicago mobster. One of the many people who were suddenly found themselves dead when the House Assassination Committee in the 1970s started trying to interview people. He's the one that ended up dead, like many others. Giancana, you probably heard of him. What do we know? What did RFK do? Within 24 hours, he was contacting the head of the CIA. I'm talking about Bobby Kennedy after his brother had been shot. That's a good point to understand where he was at. Some people say, well, he always believed the Warren Commission. Publicly. Privately, RFK, immediately after the assassination, contacted the head of the CIA and asked, did you guys do it? I mean, he knew what operations were going on. John McCone. And then he called the top mob lawyer the next day and asked the same question. In 2013, RFK Jr., Bobby Kennedy Jr., he's an environmentalist, you've probably seen him around, went down to Dallas, Texas, was asked the question about what his father thought about what happened in Dallas, and he said, my dad thought rogue CIA agents were involved in this assassination. He made that statement. You won't hear that on the news. Okay? And then documents. I try to talk to you about documents. They just released 52 pages from the oh so important Mexico City trip that Oswald did or did not do. If people want to see, it just came out. All but 5 were redacted. I mean, what in the name of national security is relevant to 54 years ago to National Security Day? I ask you that question. I think it's ridiculous, unless there's something embarrassing there. And I point out these things. Whether Oswald was there or not, some say no. I mean, it was somebody witnessed the Warren Commission had named Silvio Deo, said, I met with some Cubans and a guy named Oswald at the same time, and Oswald was in Mexico City. I just think there were a lot of things going on, and I think Oswald was probably in Mexico City. Documents show that, maybe on an anti-Castro mission, which proves he's probably an intelligence agent, but I think there are other people there too doing some other things, making phone calls, doing things, trying to lay a trail to make Oswald trace back to the Cubans, Castro, and then the assassination goes down on who you're going to blame for it. Simple. Okay? The final straws, I think, occurred in mid-1963, at least from one perspective. I mean, Kennedy was really moving towards ending the Cold War, making peace with the Soviets. He signed this nuclear test ban treaty. There were extremist elements in the United States that simply did not want to see that happen, to make peace with the Soviets. He was making plans to make a secret pullout from Vietnam, which was just a total abomination to people who thought he was soft on communism, possibly committing treason, ending the war, not getting out of Vietnam when they wanted to go into Vietnam, so on and so on. And then to top it off, Kennedy's even making rapprochement, which means secret talks with Castro about ending that whole thing. Because I think we came to the brink of World War III with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy saw that we need to end this thing, and he never got that chance. So, is that a motive? Is this part of this? Could be. And again, I almost feel like I'm not doing justice to all this. I'm trying to keep this thing rolling. You need to do your own investigation on some of these things. And I'm not going to tell you that this is what happened. You need to make your own mind up about what happened. You need to investigate and continue to look yourself. But I'm trying to give you these things. Okay? Of course, LBJ and his Texas oil cronies. That has oftentimes been a whole number of things pointed in Johnson's direction. And you do have, these are legitimate questions. You go down the list, and the answer always comes back to him or his cronies. Who lured Kennedy to Dallas? Well, Jack Valenti and John Connally, LBJ's cronies. I mean, convinced Kennedy had to come to Dallas to heal the Democratic Party wounds. And then to top it off, Lyndon Johnson announces the trip in April of '63 before Kennedy approved it. You think he won in there pretty bad? Who controlled the evidence in the cover-up? Well, who controlled the seat in Dallas but Texas people? Where did he get shot at? Who controlled the scene? Johnson and his oil people owned everything in Dallas.